why to support small businesses. And these are things that many of you will have probably seen before. And I shared a couple that are maybe like less well known. I think, you know, that how local businesses cultivate community well-being and cohesion. And I think anybody that has spent time in a coffee shop or in a barber shop or salon like recognizes that. And I mention it because, Nick, you can jump to the next slide. Those are the businesses that, you know, that we're really talking about that are really at risk of not opening. So when Sylvie talks about, you know, a third of businesses on commercial corridors being at risk, I will like encourage you to think about, you know, where you go for your coffee, and hopefully it's not Starbucks, and where you go for your favorite bowl of pho or tacos. And those, like, you know, small local independently owned places are really at risk. More commonly known is, you know, how much money is recirculated into the community when you shop locally. About 48% of purchases versus 14% of purchases that are done at chain stores. We can talk about how, you know, small business ownership reduces inequality and expands the middle class with a higher percentage of local small businesses have stronger per capita income growth, faster employment growth, and lower poverty rates than their peers. And then just how entrepreneurship leads to job creation and higher wages. And, you know, there's often this temptation to focus on tech startups when we talk about, you know, innovation and entrepreneurship. And the Institute for Local Self-Reliance talks about how, you know, expanding opportunities for residents to launch businesses that meet community needs in retail, services, food production, and other sectors are the ones where there's even greater impact. And so, you know, among this group and those that you speak to, I really encourage us to think about those opportunities. This next slide is really, you don't really have to spend time on it. I never thought that I would be like quoting Jerome Powell, but, you know, that really thinking about, and this is true when we start talking about education, as many of our prior panelists did, but really that not only are we looking at the loss of these small and medium-sized businesses and what it means for those business owners, but that these are the same business owners that are most responsible for creating jobs. And that's historically true in other downturns in the economy. And that we need to be thinking about that supporting these small businesses is a poverty reduction strategy. There is a ripple effect that will happen if we can't keep these businesses open, that it's not just for the business owners themselves, but it's for the communities that they serve and the opportunities for additional job creation. Next slide. Again, just some statistics here about where the statistics about from 2013, this is courtesy of the Economy League. We know that Black-owned businesses with paid employees make up just 2.5% of all local enterprises. Nationwide, that's even less, 2.2%. And that there's a lot of work for us to do in this area. Next slide. Again, when we start talking about COVID, and we know that the impact on small businesses has been much worse for Black and Brown-owned businesses, in the same way that we know that like the health incomes in those communities are much worse than they are for others. And you know, really needing to look at the structural policies and practices that are responsible for this among businesses are the same practices and policies that are responsible for it across the board, communities in color for poor health outcomes as well. Next slide. Oh, it's my 5 minutes, you guys. Okay. So I wanted to just talk about being intentional, and it sort of feels like it's a no-brainer. But this acknowledgement that the system within we're working was intentionally designed to disenfranchise and discriminate, and that we need to be even more intentional about the work that we do to dismantle that system and to create something new. And I think that, you know, for most of us, our work has largely focused on addressing symptoms rather than that more complicated work of getting to the root causes of what created the system to begin with. If this were a different conversation or a different panel, I would suggest that we all like take psychedelics and like rewire our brains to like think differently about how we can approach this. And that's a different, that can be a different conversation that we have. But I, you know, in listening to panelists that have talked, you know, there was, you know, I think it was Brian who talked about how, you know, feedback on the city's poverty plan was that city council often always approaches the same people, right? And I think a lot of us are stuck in these ways of doing things that we really, really, really need to like think about how we start approaching this work differently and who we're inviting into the conversations. Because if we don't, to Sylvie's point, like we will waste this opportunity, right? We will waste this crisis and our ability to do things differently. The next slide. So I just wanted to share quickly, like for the Merchants Fund, what like this intentional grant making has looked like. And I will say that, you know, so I started with the Merchants Fund in this role at the end of 2018, after serving as both a board member and having been a prior grantee, small business owner. I was the first former grantee to join the board. That's something that we've continued to my predecessors' credit. 2019 was the first year that we asked our grantees to self-report on race and ethnicity. And so you can see, I don't know if you can see like what it says, but like that last year, you know, 50% of the grants that we made were to white or Caucasian owned businesses, and just about 25% to Black owned businesses. In 2020, and this is really largely just all our COVID relief grants that we did, really being committed to ensuring that we were reaching people who were falling through the cracks and did not have access to other funding. We flipped that, right? 50%. And this is like from a couple weeks ago. So, and actually with the grants that we've made in the last few weeks, it would skew even higher to Black owned businesses, but really making a focus on supporting people of color and immigrant owned businesses. We've also employed a participatory grant making model for our COVID grants so that we have past grantees that are on that committee making recommendations for grants as well. And the other thing that we did with our COVID grants was really focus on poverty. And so we were looking at poverty rates over 25%. And it was an invitation only process where we worked very closely with our grantees. And so that was like something that was different from what we've ever done before, but did allow us to be much more intentional in who we were reaching and who we were funding. So there have been these conversations about property, right? Who owns property and like wealth generation. And what I've heard consistently from all of the panelists is, you know, examples of cross-sector partnerships, private-public partnerships. Guy talked about the example of Wistar, the partnership between PHA and CCP. And I was able to buy this house in 2009 because I was low income and I qualified for a first-time low-income homebuyer program. The only reason I knew about that program was because I was working for a nonprofit at the time. It was at the time that First Union was buying core states, and I was working for a nonprofit that was making sure that they weren't going to do away with programs for low-income communities. And so I'm sitting in this conference room while they're doing this presentation, and they're doing this like slide about low-income home buying. That's me. And like, I knew that I was broke, right? Like, I knew that I was broke. I had a graduate degree, and I was working for a nonprofit, and I loved the work that I was doing, but I never in my wildest dreams did I think that I could buy a house. So my point is, I was able to buy this house, and a few years later, it appreciated in value. And because of that, I was able to start a business. And because I was able to start a business, I was able to like be on the path that I'm on. As we come together and find ways where the private sector and government, that we're creating more programs like this, we're just not going to get to where we need to be. Thank you.